Hello and welcome to making paper mache with Kells. Today we're going to go over how to take a paper mache mold. You can do this on almost anything. We're going to be doing it on a hand. And you can either do your own hand or you can actually, it's easier if you actually do someone else's. The paper mache in itself is not super strong, and when you put it on, it's going to take a long time for it to harden. Unlike plaster, where you put it on in about 15 minutes, it's pretty much ready to come off and it's nice and stiff. This is going to take a couple of hours to harden up, enough to where it won't lose its shape. And because it's not really feasible to walk around with it on your hand, what we're going to do is make a substrate, and the substrate is going to be made out of aluminum foil. So we just take 2 sheets of aluminum foil. I like to put the dull side up. There's a shiny side and a dull side. And I want to spread your hand out as wide as you can and tuck a little bit of the foil down in between the fingers, and then just start to crunch it, and I like to curl it up around the fingertips underneath. And I like to, instead of just wrapping it around, I like to kind of bundle the foil. It gives it a little rigidity so that when you go to take this off, it holds shape better. It also makes it easier to grab onto when you're taking it off. So when you do the first layer, the idea is we're going to try and get the creases in there so that we can still see it on the finished product. And to help it stick a little bit better between the foil layers, because they don't stick real well, what I do is I put a little bit of white glue on the foil. Now, the white glue gets used in a couple different ways. We use it between layers of the foil. We also use it in making the solution for the paper mache. Now, our paper mache solution is 1 cup of water with about 1/3 of a cup of flour stirred into it. You want to just add a little bit at a time, gently stir it in until it gets to be this really milky looking water. And then about 2 good tablespoons of white glue. And it doesn't have to be measured precisely or anything. It just, it's your best guesstimate. Now when I do the second layer, I put the dull side down because it tends to glue better. And I kind of crumple it up. I don't want it to be super smooth because those crumples actually give a lot of strength to it. We can compress them down afterward. But back to the solution. So I want to really get that water and flour mixture really mixed up as nicely as I can. And first I mix in the flour, then I mix in about 2 tablespoons of glue. And like I said, it's a guesstimate. Any white glue works. Elmer's seems to work a little nicer than others, but any white school glue, household glue, that's all water soluble, and that should work just fine. So I've got that all mixed up in here, and now it's time for me to start applying my cut paper. Now the paper I've cut up into like little 1 inch to 1.5 inch wide strips, and first thing I want to do is I want to start setting my perimeter, which means the edge. And it's kind of tough to get it to stick. I find that squeezing it down kind of helps, but it's not going to stick really well until you start getting into that second and sometimes third layer. So I'm going to just keep adding the paper. Now, paper choices, I like newspaper because it absorbs really well, but it's not good for the finished coat. Because if we're going to do any decoration on it, you're either going to need to have white paint or another lighter single colored paper to go over the outside. So I use things like printer paper. I don't like shiny magazine papers because they don't absorb the solution well, which means they don't stick together later on as well, and they're not as strong. Now, I don't like to throw, I've seen people do this and it hasn't worked very well for them. They've just thrown a whole lot of paper into the solution and then they just start pulling pieces out. What happens is the paper absorbs too much of the solution and it starts getting to be really easily torn, and that's not a good thing. Now you'll also notice that I'm working on a surface and I've covered the surface with newspaper. Now you could cover your surface with newspaper. It could be brown shopping bags. If you have any plastic sheets, that could work. I prefer the paper products because one, when you're through, they can just be thrown out and it's not going to contaminate anything. And two, they absorb, so the stuff doesn't tend to just run off onto the floor. If you can do it outside, or when you're through, you can just literally take the garden hose and just hose it off. That would be wonderful, but not everyone has that situation. So wherever you are, if you're choosing this option, make sure that you protect the area. You don't want to have stuff all over the place. Your parents will not be amused if you get starchy, gluey water laid out all over. Now, some of you may not have flour, and that's okay. There's substitutes, believe it or not. And one of the best substitutes is actually if you cook pasta or mashed potatoes. Instead of draining the water off down the drain, if you actually pour the pasta or the potato water off into a little pot, let it sit overnight, all that starch will actually sink to the bottom or to the bottom levels. And if you scoop off the top half of that water, that makes an excellent starchy water. Now, for those of you that actually know people that have liquid starch, it's used a lot in pressing uniforms and military shirts and pants. If you've got liquid starch, that works really well too. And the nice thing is it dissolves super quick and it's easy to do. But starchy water just from cooking water works just fine. So I'm laying lots of layers on, and I'm going to start crisscrossing them now. I've gone one layer that's gone pretty much the same direction as my hand. I'm now going to start going sideways. That's going to give it a lot more strength too. And if I start getting a lot of puddles of water in front of me, I will dip my paper right in those puddles to help absorb it and keep it from rolling off onto the floor and landing on top of my shoes or the floor. And once I get a couple layers of that paper down, I'm going to switch over to my white paper now. And this is going to be my finished coat. And I'd like to have at least 2 layers of the white paper. So I'm going to continue doing this. But the nice thing about the foil is that it allows us to actually take this off our hand when we're through. And if we have like a little pillow of crumpled paper or plastic bags, we can lay that on top of that pillow and that'll help support it. And it will hold its shape as it dries. We really want it to sit overnight before we try and take that aluminum foil substrate off. Now there are advantages to paper mache. One, it's easy to find materials for it. two, for the most part, aside from maybe buying some glue, you rarely have to actually buy materials for it that you don't already have. And three, compared to plaster, it's very light when it's finally all done, whereas plaster tends to be a bit heavier. And the nice thing is, if we don't like our edges when we're through, or if it's a little raggedy around the edges, it's not a big deal. We can take a pair of scissors and we can trim paper mache. Whereas the plaster, it's very hard, and afterward, if we don't like part of the shape, there's really no way to adjust it. We can't trim it down to make it smaller. Cutting holes in it is very difficult. So we have to be quite a bit more careful when we're making plaster forms. So I would continue on with the second layer. Right now I'm just trying to show that, you know, I've got this layer of white going, and that's kind of nice because for the next phase of the assignment you're going to have a decoration on the surface, and trying to decorate a newsprint covered surface is a bit challenging. So you have to either paint it white or come up with extremely dark colors, which tends to hide your design. So we're just going to pretend that I've gone over this with a whole nother layer of white, and it's time to take it off. So before I do, I want to go and I want to do my final press down, and I'm going to really kind of concentrate on getting the shape to what I want it to be. And this is where squeezing it gets rid of a lot of the little puckers that happen in the paper, and it also helps gets rid of some of the excess moisture between layers, and it tends to hold a better shape. So when I take this off, I don't want to grab the paper mache itself. I'm trying to just move little parts out at a time, and I'm going to try and just hold the foil. So now that's got this, and if I have a little crumpled paper or a plastic shopping bag, that'll help it keep this shape a little better. And that's pretty much it. I just want to let it sit overnight, and then I can start trimming it and getting it ready for the second stage. Now, this is an example of one that we did that had just the newsprint. And as you can see, it's super light, but it does hold the form. And because it is made with paper, we can trim it with either a knife or scissors afterward. And it does hold the shape rather well. This is what it looks like when we have the foil still in, and it's got the white coating. So for this one, we just did this one yesterday. When it's time to take the foil out, we just want to gently go in and start separating all the way around at the edges. And if you're careful, you can get a second mold out of the foil. You can get your hand in there. And this one's ready to be trimmed, so we can take a pair of scissors and we can draw a line around what we want the outside edge to be, and we can go in and just kind of trim gently. And you know, it's a nice stiff piece, and it's holding its shape. So it's ready for the second phase of the hand project. So with this in mind, keep in mind that, you know, one, protect your area. Make sure that you've got all of your stuff ready to go before you start. You've got your water, your flour mixed up, add the glue in. I still stir it up as I go, just to keep it mixed well. And you can, if you have a lid to put this on and you stick it in the fridge, this will last for a day or two. So you can use this again the following week. It'll last up to a week as long as it's put in the fridge. If not, I would just throw it away. Just pour it out. I wouldn't pour it down the sink if you can help it. It's not terrible unless you're washing a lot of water through it. But that's about it. So just put this someplace safe and warm to dry, and overnight it'll be ready to peel the aluminum off, and you're ready for stage 2. All right, thanks a lot, and thanks for joining me.